Doyen wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stared at the flashing red lights on his console. The New Horizon had been cruising through the Kepler sector for 3 weeks now, carrying mining equipment to the outer colonies. It was supposed to be a boring run, the kind that paid well but put you to sleep from routine. "Hey Doyen, you seeing this?" called out Minho from the communications station. His voice had that edge that meant trouble. "I'm picking up a distress beacon. Weak signal, but it's definitely not human." Captain Jamin looked up from his coffee, already frowning. "How far off course would we have to go?" Doyen ran the calculations quickly. "About 4 hours, maybe 5 if we want to be careful about it." "That's a lot of fuel for something that might be a false alarm," the captain muttered. Company policy was clear about unnecessary detours. Every hour off course meant credits lost, and the New Horizon wasn't exactly swimming in profit margins. But Doyen was already pulling up the sensor data. What he saw made his stomach drop. "Captain, I'm reading massive structural damage. Whatever's out there, it's falling apart fast." The debate didn't last long. For all his complaints about company policy, Captain Jamin was old school. You didn't leave people to die in space, no matter what species they were. 20 minutes. Later, the New Horizon was changing course toward the distress signal. When they finally reached the coordinates, Doyen couldn't believe what he was seeing. The alien ship looked like it had been through a war. Hull plates were missing, conduits sparked with electrical fires, and the whole thing was venting atmosphere through dozens of holes. It was maybe half the size of their own vessel, with a sleek design that looked more grown than built. "Life signs?" asked Captain Yemin. Doyen's fingers danced across his console. "1. Very weak. The ship's power core is going critical too. I'd say we have maybe 30 minutes before it goes up." The captain's face went pale. Standard procedure was to bring survivors aboard using the transport beam, but the alien ship's hull was too damaged. The transport couldn't get a clean lock through all that twisted metal and energy interference. "We could try the boarding pod," suggested Hyunji from the pilot station. But even she sounded doubtful. The boarding pod wasn't designed for rescue operations, especially not on a ship that was about to explode. Doyen was already suiting up before anyone could stop him. "I'm going over there." "The hell you are," Captain Jamin said. "That ship is a death trap." "Someone's alive in there," Doyen replied, checking his suit's life support systems. "Human or alien, doesn't matter. We can't just watch them die." The argument was brief but heated. Company policy, insurance liability, contamination protocols, the works. But Doyen had made up his mind. He'd been an engineer for 15 years, and he'd never lost anyone on his watch. He wasn't about to start now. The boarding pod shuddered as it connected to the alien ship's hull. Doyen cut through the twisted metal with his plasma torch, working as fast as he dared. The air inside was thick with smoke and strange, sweet-smelling gases that made his suit's filters work overtime. He found her in what looked like the ship's control room. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, with pale blue skin and silver hair that seemed to glow in the emergency lighting. Her leg was trapped under a fallen beam, and she was unconscious from blood loss. Doyen worked quickly to free her, using his suit's mechanical arms to lift the beam. She was lighter than he expected, almost fragile. As he carried her toward the boarding pod, her eyes fluttered open. They were large and golden, like nothing he'd ever seen. She said something in a language that sounded like music mixed with wind chimes. Even through his suit's speakers, it was beautiful. "It's okay," he told her, though he doubted she understood. "You're safe now." The alien ship's power core chose that moment to start its final meltdown sequence. Doyen ran for the boarding pod as the corridor behind them filled with fire and twisted metal. They made it aboard just as the alien ship tore itself apart in a brilliant explosion that lit up the darkness of space. Back on the New Horizon, Doyen looked down at the unconscious alien girl in the medical bay. He'd saved her life, but he had no idea that this simple act of human decency was about to turn his world upside down. Arin's eyes snapped open like someone had flipped a switch. One moment she was unconscious, the next she was sitting bolt upright, in the medical bay, speaking rapidly in a language that sounded like singing, mixed with the tinkling of glass bells. Doyen nearly dropped his coffee mug. He'd been keeping watch over her for the past 6 hours, making sure the alien medical equipment they'd cobbled together was keeping her stable. The ship's doctor, Kyung-soo, had done his best, but treating an alien was mostly guesswork. "Whoa, easy there," Do-yeon said, raising his hands peacefully. "You're safe, you're on our ship." But Arin wasn't looking at him like he was her rescuer. She was looking at him like he was something incredible and terrifying at the same time. Her golden eyes were wide, and she kept touching her chest with both hands while speaking in that musical language. "Minho," Do-yeon called over the ship's comm, "get down here. We need that translation program running." Minho arrived 5 minutes later, lugging his portable translation unit. The thing was the size of a briefcase, and probably cost more than Do-yeon made in a year, but it was the best language processor money could buy. "Give me a second to calibrate," Minho muttered, connecting sensors and adjusting frequencies. Alien languages are tricky. The computer needs to build a pattern from scratch. Arin watched the whole process with fascination, but she never stopped talking. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam. When the translation unit finally clicked online, her voice suddenly became understandable. "The sacred debt is formed. The bond cannot be broken. The life-giver must be honored. The circle must be completed." "Okay, that's not ominous at all," muttered Kyung-soo from the corner. Arin suddenly focused on Do-yeon with laser intensity. "You are the one who pulled me from the fire death?" Yeah," Do-yeon said slowly. "Your ship was exploding. I couldn't just leave you there." What happened next was completely unexpected. Arin slid off the medical table, ignored the fact that her leg was still bandaged, and dropped to her knees in front of Do-yeon. She pressed her forehead to the floor and started speaking in a formal, ritualistic tone. "I am Arin of the Third House, daughter of High Counselor Theron, keeper of the ancient ways. You have given me life when death claimed me. By the laws of my people, I am bound to you until the debt is balanced." The three humans looked at each other with growing alarm. Minho was frantically typing on his translation unit, trying to make sense of the cultural context. "Look, Arin," Do-yeon said, feeling awkward about talking to someone who was bowing on the floor. "You don't owe me anything. I just did what anyone would do." Arin's head snapped up, and for the first time she looked genuinely shocked. "What anyone would do, you risked the fire death for a stranger of another world. Among my people, such courage creates a sacred bond. You are now my life-keeper." "You're what now?" Kyung-soo asked. Minho's translation unit beeped, and his face went pale as he read the cultural data streaming across his screen. "Oh boy, Do-yeon, I think we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind where she's basically royalty, and you just became her." "Well, it's complicated. The computer is having trouble with the exact translation, but it's something between a guardian, a protector, and—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "And something the machine keeps translating as honor-bonded." Arin stood up gracefully, despite her injured leg. "Your translation systems are crude but functional. Yes, I am of noble birth. Yes, a life debt has been created. And yes, this bond is considered sacred among the Valeth." Captain Jaemin's voice crackled over the comm system. "Do-yeon, what's all this chatter about sacred bonds? I'm getting some very interesting readings on our long-range scanners." "What kind of readings?" Do-yeon asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know. "The kind where 3 Valeth warships just dropped out of hyperspace and are heading our way. Fast." Arin smiled for the first time since waking up, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that meant your simple life just got infinitely more complicated. "My father has found me," she said simply. "Now the real complications begin." Do-yeon looked around at his crewmates' worried faces and wondered why he'd ever thought saving someone's life could be simple. In human culture, you saved people because it was the right thing to do. You didn't expect ancient laws and sacred debts and warships to get involved. But as he watched Arin struggle to explain concepts that didn't exist in human language, he realized that what seemed simple to humans might be earth-shatteringly important to aliens. And he was about to learn just how different their cultures really were. The Valeth Prime Station was unlike anything Do-yeon had ever seen. Instead of the cold metal and harsh angles of human space stations, this place looked like it had been carved from a single massive crystal. Soft blue light pulsed through translucent walls, and the docking bay curved in impossible spirals that somehow made perfect sense when you looked at them. "Well, this is fancy," muttered Minho, as the New Horizon settled into the docking clamps. Through the viewports they could see dozens of Valeth moving with fluid grace across the station's platforms. Captain Jamin was sweating bullets. 3 warships had escorted them here, and while the Valeth had been polite, it was clear this wasn't a request. "Remember, everyone stays calm. We drop off their princess, say thank you very much, and get the hell out of here." Arryn had been quiet during the approach, but now she stood straighter, her whole demeanor changing. The injured girl they'd rescued was transforming into someone who clearly knew how to command respect. "Doyen," she said, turning to him with those unsettling golden eyes, "my father will want to speak with you personally. It is important that you understand our customs." "What kind of customs?" Doyen asked, though he was beginning to dread the answer. Before Arryn could reply, the airlock chimed. Captain Jamin opened the connection, and immediately the ship's atmosphere shifted. The Valeth didn't just walk aboard. They flowed like water, their movement so coordinated it was almost like watching a dance. The leader was clearly Arryn's father. He had the same pale blue skin and silver hair, but where Arryn was delicate, he was imposing. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to see everything at once. His clothes were simple but elegant, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that made people automatically stand straighter. "I am High Counselor Theron," he said in perfect English, though his accent made every word sound like music. "I have come for my daughter." "Of course," Captain Jamin said quickly. "She's right here, safe and sound. My engineer Doyen pulled her from her damaged ship." Theron's gaze shifted to Doyen, and suddenly the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. It wasn't hostile exactly, but it was intense in a way that made Doyen's skin crawl. "You are the life-giver," Theron said. It wasn't a question. "I just did what anyone would do," Doyen replied, echoing what he'd told Arryn earlier. Several of the Valeth behind Theron made soft sounds that the translation unit interpreted as surprise or amusement. Theron himself tilted his head slightly, studying Doyen like he was some kind of fascinating puzzle. "Arryn," Theron said, without taking his eyes off Doyen, "you have explained the situation to them." "I tried, Father. Their language lacks the proper concepts. They do not understand the weight of what has occurred." Now Theron did look hostile. "They do not understand. The life debt is sacred. It cannot be ignored or dismissed." Captain Jamin stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Look, Counselor, we're just merchants. We helped your daughter because it was the right thing to do. No payment necessary." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the soft humming of the ship's systems seemed too loud. The Valeth were staring at the humans like they'd just announced their intention to blow up the station. "Payment?" Theron repeated slowly. "You believe this is about payment?" Arryn placed a gentle hand on her father's arm. "Father, they truly do not understand. Their culture is different." "Different," Theron mused. "Yes, I am beginning to see that." He turned back to Doyen. "Young human, you have created a bond that cannot be broken by ignorance or cultural differences. My daughter's life belongs to you now, just as yours belongs to her. This is not negotiable." "Wait, what?" Doyen said, his voice cracking slightly. "Nobody said anything about belonging to anyone. The honor cycle must be completed," Theron continued as if Doyen hadn't spoken. "You will come with us to the station. Your crew will remain here while arrangements are made." "Arrangements for what?" Captain Jamin demanded. "The bonding ceremony," Arryn said quietly. "It is required by law." That's when everything went sideways. Captain Jamin started arguing about diplomatic immunity. Minho was frantically trying to contact the Earth Embassy. Kyung-Soo was backing toward the engine room, like he was planning to make a run for it. But what really got Doyen's attention was the way more Valeth kept boarding the ship. They moved with polite efficiency, but within minutes it was clear that the New Horizon wasn't going anywhere. The humans weren't prisoners exactly, but they weren't free to leave either. "This is insane," Doyen said to Arryn. "I saved your life. That should be the end of it." "Among humans, perhaps," Arryn replied. "But you did not save a human life. You saved a Valeth life, and that means Valeth law applies." "Since when?" "Since the moment you chose to risk your own life for mine. The bond was created whether you understood it or not." Doyen looked around at his crewmates, all of whom were staring at him with expressions ranging from sympathy to outright panic. Through the viewport, he could see the vast crystal structure of Valeth Prime Station waiting for him. He'd always heard that no good deed goes unpunished. He'd just never expected the punishment to involve alien marriage laws and diplomatic incidents. All he'd wanted to do was save someone's life. How had it gotten so complicated so fast? 3 days into what was supposed to be a simple passenger drop-off, Doyen was starting to feel like a very polite prisoner. The quarters they'd given him on Valeth Prime Station were nicer than his apartment back on Earth, all flowing curves and soft lighting that somehow knew exactly how bright he needed it to be. But nice or not, he couldn't leave. Every time he tried to head back to the New Horizon, another smiling Valeth would appear and gently suggest he might enjoy visiting the cultural center instead. Or perhaps he'd like to try some traditional Valeth cuisine. Always polite, always friendly, always blocking his path back to his ship. That's when Jiwon arrived. Doyun had never been so happy to see another human being in his life. Jiwon stepped off the embassy shuttle looking like she'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy, her diplomatic credentials hanging around her neck and her expression set to professional annoyance. "Let me guess," she said, when she found Doyun in what the Valeth called a contemplation garden. "You thought you were just saving someone's life." "That's usually how it works, yeah," Doyun replied. "You see someone in trouble, you help them, they say thanks, everyone goes home happy." Jiwon sat down on the crystal bench beside him, pulling out a tablet thick with legal documents. "Unfortunately, Engineer Kim, you've stumbled into one of the most complex legal traditions in known space. I've been reading Valeth law for the past 18 hours straight, and I'm getting a headache just thinking about it. How bad is it? Remember when you were a kid, and you accidentally broke something expensive, and your parents made you work off the debt doing extra chores? Yeah? This is like that, except the thing you broke was cosmic balance itself, and the chores involve binding your soul to someone else's for the rest of your natural life." Doyun stared at her. "You're joking." "I wish I was." Jiwon flipped through her notes. "Okay, here's what I've learned. The Valeth believe that every life saved creates what they call a cosmic imbalance. The universe gave Aaron a death, you took it away, so now the universe is owed something. That's crazy. To us, maybe. To them, it's as real as gravity. The only way to restore balance is through something called the honor binding ceremony. Aaron has to formally transfer her life debt to you, and you have to accept responsibility for her continued existence." Doyun felt his stomach drop. "What does that actually mean?" "That's where it gets complicated." Jiwon showed him a diagram on her tablet that looked like a family tree crossed with a corporate flowchart. "In Valeth society, honor is everything. It determines your social status, your legal rights, even who you can marry. When Aaron binds her honor to you, you become responsible for her actions, and she becomes responsible for yours." "Like marriage?" "No. That's what makes this so weird. It's not romantic at all. Think of it more like adoption, maybe, or a really intense business partnership. You'd be legally considered family, but not the kind that—" She gestured vaguely. "You know," a new voice interrupted them. "Your diplomat friend explains it well, though she misses some nuances." They turned to see Aaron approaching, moving with that fluid grace all Valeth seemed to possess. She wore simple robes today, but somehow still managed to look regal. "What nuances?" Jiwon asked, switching immediately into professional mode. Aaron settled gracefully onto another crystal formation that somehow functioned as a chair. "The binding ceremony would make Doyun a member of my family house, not through marriage, but through what you might call spiritual adoption. He would have all the rights and responsibilities of a blood relative." "And what exactly does that involve?" Doyun asked. "You would be considered nobility," Aaron said simply. "Third rank, same as me. You would have estates, servants, a voice in council meetings. You would also be expected to uphold the honor of House Theron, defend our interests and—" She paused, looking uncomfortable. "And never leave Valeth space without permission from the High Council." "So I'd be a prisoner?" "You would be family," Aaron corrected. "Family does not abandon family. Jiwon was typing furiously on her tablet. This is insane. You can't just forcibly adopt someone into nobility because they performed a rescue. We can if that someone interfered with cosmic law, said a new voice. High Counselor Theron appeared as if from nowhere, though Doyun was beginning to suspect the Valeth were just naturally good at that. With respect, Counselor, Jiwon said, standing up and putting on her diplomat voice. Cosmic law isn't recognized in Earth legal systems. But we are not in Earth space, Theron replied calmly. We are in Valeth space where Valeth law applies. Your engineer created a life debt when he chose to save my daughter. That debt must be honored. And if he refuses? The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush planets. Theron and Arin exchanged a look that spoke volumes. No one has ever refused, Arin said quietly. The concept doesn't exist in our language. Well, it exists in ours, Doyun said, standing up, and I'm thinking about it pretty seriously right now. Then's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around them. That would be unfortunate, he said. A refusal would be seen as a rejection of our most sacred laws. It would be considered an act of dishonor so profound that it could destabilize diplomatic relations between our peoples. Jiwon's face went pale. Are you threatening to end the peace treaty over one engineer? I am explaining the consequences of ignoring our most fundamental beliefs, Theron replied. The choice, as always, remains with the life-giver. Doyun looked around at the beautiful crystal garden, at the alien princess whose life he'd saved, at the diplomat who was trying to save his, and at the High Counselor who held the fate of human-Valeth relations in his hands. All he'd wanted to do was help someone. Now the future of two species might depend on whether he was willing to give up his human life to become an alien nobleman. Sometimes, he thought, no good deed really did go unpunished. The great council chamber of Valeth Prime Station felt like being inside a cathedral made of starlight. Hundreds of Valeth had gathered to witness what should have been a simple ceremony, their pale blue faces turned toward the central platform where Doyun stood, feeling like he was about to disappoint. An entire civilization. High Counselor Theron had pulled out all the stops. Ancient banners hung from the crystalline walls, each one representing thousands of years of Valeth tradition. Soft music that sounded like wind through crystal chimes filled the air. Even the lighting seemed more ceremonial, casting everything in a warm golden glow that made the assembled crowd look like they were glowing from within. This is your last chance to reconsider, Jiwon whispered beside him. She'd been working around the clock for 3 days, trying to find some legal loophole that would let Doyun off the hook. So far, she'd come up empty. Doyun looked across the platform at Arin, who stood perfectly still in elaborate ceremonial robes that seemed to be made of woven moonlight. Her face was composed, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she held the ceremonial honor cord that would bind them together. The ceremony will begin, Theron announced, his voice carrying easily through the vast chamber. Let all witness as the life debt is honored and cosmic balance restored. That's when Doyun stepped forward and said the words that changed everything. I refuse. The silence that followed was so complete that Doyun could hear his own heartbeat. 500 Valeth stared at him in what he could only describe as stunned horror, like he'd just announced his intention to murder their children. You refuse. Theron repeated as if the words didn't make sense in his mouth. I refuse, Doyun said again, louder this time. I saved Arin's life because she needed help, not because I wanted anything from her, not because I expected a reward. I did it because leaving someone to die when you can help them is wrong. A ripple of disturbed whispers ran through the crowd. The translation devices were working overtime, but Doyun could tell that some concepts weren't translating properly. The Valeth language seemed to lack words for what he was trying to explain. Among humans, Doyun continued, we help each other because it's the right thing to do. We don't create debts or bonds or cosmic obligations. We help because that's what decent people do. Then's face had gone from surprise to something approaching outrage. You speak of cosmic law as if it means nothing, as if the balance of the universe is a trivial matter. I speak of it as something that shouldn't control people's lives, Doyun shot back. Arin didn't choose to be rescued. I didn't choose to create some cosmic debt. Why should either of us be forced into a bond we never agreed to? That's when Arin spoke up, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, despite how quietly she spoke. He's right. The gasps from the crowd were audible. This time, several elderly Valeth looked like they might faint. Even Theron took a step backward, staring at his daughter in shock. "Arryn," he said carefully, "you cannot mean that." "I do mean it, Father." Arryn's voice grew stronger. "For 3 days, I have watched this human and his people. I have seen how they interact with each other. They help because they choose to help. They show kindness because they want to, not because ancient laws compel them." She turned to face the crowd, her ceremonial robes rustling like water. "Doyen saved my life expecting nothing in return. He would have done the same for any of you, or for a complete stranger, or even for an enemy. That kind of compassion cannot be commanded or purchased or bound by ceremony." "This is heresy," someone called from the crowd. "This is truth," Arryn replied firmly. "I have learned something from these humans that our laws never taught me. Real honor comes from choice, not obligation." Theron looked like he'd aged a decade in the past few minutes. "Daughter, you speak of abandoning traditions that have guided our people for millennia. I speak of learning from people who save lives simply because it's right to save lives. Is that not a tradition worth considering?" The argument that followed was unlike anything Doyen had ever witnessed. Valeth didn't shout or gesture wildly like humans did. Instead, they spoke with increasing intensity while maintaining perfect composure, their musical voices rising and falling like a symphony of disagreement. Some supported Arryn's position, arguing that the humans had shown them a new way to think about honor and duty. Others were horrified at the suggestion that cosmic law could be simply ignored. Still others seemed fascinated by the philosophical implications of choice versus obligation. Through it all, Doyen stood on the platform feeling like he'd accidentally started a revolution. All he'd wanted was to avoid being forced into alien nobility. Instead, he'd apparently challenged the foundation of an entire civilization's moral framework. Jiwon leaned over to him. "Well, congratulations. You've just triggered the biggest theological crisis in Valeth history. Is that good or bad? Ask me in a few years if we're all still alive." On the platform, Arryn was still arguing with her father, her voice passionate but controlled. "These humans have shown me that true honor cannot be compelled, Father. It must be freely given, or it means nothing." Doyen realized that regardless of what happened next, nothing would ever be the same. Not for him, not for Arryn, and not for the relationship between humans and Valeth. Sometimes doing the right thing meant changing everything. The ancient library deep within Valeth Prime Station was nothing like the sterile data centers Doyen was used to. Instead of computer terminals and holographic displays, the walls were lined with crystalline formations that pulsed with soft light when touched. Each crystal contained thousands of years of Valeth history, lore, and tradition, all stored in patterns of light that sang when accessed. Sunwoo ran his hands through his hair in frustration as another crystal went dark. "This is impossible. I can barely figure out how to turn these things on, let alone search through them for legal precedents." "That's because you're thinking like an engineer," said Hannah, the xenobiologist who'd been flown in from the embassy along with a team of cultural specialists. "These aren't machines, they're more like living archives," she demonstrated by placing her palm flat against one of the larger crystals. Instead of pushing buttons or giving voice commands, she simply thought about what she wanted to find. The crystal responded by glowing brighter and projecting a series of images into the air above them. "How did you figure that out?" asked Jamin, one of the Valeth scholars who'd volunteered to help them search for a solution. "I watched how your people interact with them," Hannah replied. "Valeth technology isn't just responsive to commands. It responds to intent, to emotion, to the user's state of mind. Very different from human tech." Sunwoo shook his head in amazement. "No wonder we couldn't make sense of the wreckage from Arryn's ship. We were trying to reverse engineer technology. That requires telepathic interface." "Not telepathic," Jamin corrected gently. "Empathic. Our machines read emotional resonance and biological patterns. Your friend Doyen's act of rescue created such a strong emotional imprint that it triggered automatic protocols in our legal matrix. That was news to everyone. For 3 days, they'd been treating the honor debt like an arbitrary cultural tradition. Nobody had mentioned that it was actually built into Valeth technology itself." "Wait," Hana said slowly. Are you telling us that your laws aren't just social customs? They're programmed into your machines. All Valeth law is based on maintaining cosmic balance, another scholar, Viridian, explained. Our ancestors built that principle into everything. Our ships, our stations, our record-keeping systems. When a life debt is created, every Valeth computer in the network recognizes it automatically. Sunwoo's engineer brain immediately saw the problem. So even if we convince everyone that Doyun shouldn't be bound to Arin, your technology will still consider him legally obligated. Precisely. Unless we can find a legal precedent that allows the debt to be resolved in another way. That's when they got their first breakthrough. Hana had been experimenting with different emotional approaches to the archive crystals, thinking about concepts like freedom, choice, and individual rights. Most of the crystals didn't respond. Apparently these weren't concepts that appeared much in Valeth lore, but when she focused on the idea of service to the greater good, one of the oldest crystals suddenly blazed with light. Got something, she called out excitedly. The crystal projected a complex pattern of symbols and images that took the translation system several minutes to process. This is ancient, Jamin said, studying the display with growing excitement. Pre-unification era. I haven't seen legal texts this old outside of ceremonial contexts. What does it say? Sunwoo asked. Viridian was reading the symbols with the kind of concentration usually reserved for diffusing bombs. It's a provision for debt transfer, in cases where the life-giver cannot fulfill personal obligations due to circumstances beyond their control. What kind of circumstances? Originally? Death, madness, or exile to another world? Jamin looked up from the display. But the wording is broad enough that it might apply to cultural incompatibility. Hana leaned forward. How does the transfer work? The debt can be transferred from the individual to their clan, provided the clan performs a service of equivalent value to the injured party's people. Viridian paused, rereading the ancient text. In this case, it would mean Doyun's debt to Arin could be transferred to all humanity if humans as a group performed a great service for the Valeth. Sunwoo felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. What would count as a great service? That's where it gets complicated, Jamin admitted. The service has to be something that benefits all Valeth, not just Arin or her family, and it has to be something only the Life-Giver's people could accomplish. Any ideas what that might? The two Valeth scholars exchanged a meaningful look. Actually, Viridian said slowly, there might be something. We've been facing a crisis that our technology can't solve. Something that requires the kind of innovative thinking that humans are known for. What kind of crisis? Our primary power grid has been failing for months. Random shutdowns cascading. System failures, complete blackouts in some sectors. Our best engineers can't figure out what's wrong. Hana and Sunwoo looked at each other. This was exactly the kind of technical challenge that human engineers lived for. Why haven't you asked for help before now? Sunwoo asked. Pride, Jamin admitted. Valeth technology is far more advanced than human tech in most areas. Asking for help would have been embarrassing. But if we could fix your power grid problems, Hana said, that would count as a great service. More than that, Viridian said, his eyes lighting up. If you could solve a problem that our own people couldn't, it would prove that human and Valeth cooperation benefits everyone. It might even change how our people think about your species. Sunwoo was already pulling up technical schematics on his portable computer. Show me everything you've got on these power grid failures. If there's an engineering solution to this mess, we'll find it. For the first time since this whole crisis began, they had a path forward that didn't involve forcing anyone into unwanted bonds or triggering diplomatic incidents. It was still a long shot, but it was hope. And sometimes, hope was all engineers needed to work miracles. The Valeth power grid was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Doyun stood in the main reactor chamber, watching streams of pure energy flow through crystalline conduits that hummed with barely contained power. It was like being inside the heart of a star, if stars were made of singing crystal and controlled by mathematics he couldn't begin to understand. This is way above my pay grade, muttered Kiwon, the New Horizons chief technician. He was studying readouts on a Valeth diagnostic tablet, shaking his head at numbers that didn't make sense in any human context. These reactors are putting out more energy per second than Earth's entire power grid generates in a year. And they're failing, added Yerin, their systems analyst. She'd been working with Valeth engineers for the past 12 hours trying to map the cascade failures that had been plaguing the station. Look at this pattern. The shutdowns aren't random. Someone's been very carefully sabotaging the control systems. Chief Engineer Solanis, their Valeth counterpart, looked exhausted. Her usually perfect composure was cracking under the stress of keeping the station powered, while mysterious failures threatened to shut down everything from life support to artificial gravity. We discovered the sabotage 3 days ago, she explained, her musical voice tight with worry. A faction calling themselves the Pure Path has been introducing subtle corruptions into our control algorithms, nothing obvious enough to trigger security protocols, but enough to cause systematic failures. Why? Doyen asked. What do they gain from destroying your power grid? They believe contact with other species contaminates Valeth purity, Solanis replied bitterly. They think causing a crisis will force us to expel all aliens and return to isolation. Charming, Kiwon said. So we're not just fixing your power grid, we're stopping space racists. The scope of the problem was staggering. The Valeth power system wasn't like anything humans had ever built. Instead of simple electrical circuits, they used something called resonance cascades, patterns of energy that flowed through crystal matrices based on harmonic frequencies. It was incredibly efficient, but also incredibly fragile. One disrupted frequency could shut down an entire sector. The saboteurs know our systems better than we do, Solanis admitted. Every time we fix one problem, they create 2 more. We're losing the battle. That's where human stubbornness comes in handy, Yerin said with a grim smile. We don't know your systems well enough to be scared of them. Sometimes ignorance is an advantage. The first major failure hit while they were still planning their approach. Half the station's lighting went dark, and the gravity fluctuated wildly for about 30 seconds. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made the crystal corridors look like the inside of a beating heart. Reactor 7 is offline, reported one of the Valeth technicians. Resonance cascade collapsed completely. Can you restart it? Doyen asked. Not safely. The frequency patterns are too unstable. If we try to bring it back online wrong, the explosion could take out half the station. That's when Doyen made the decision that would either save Valeth Prime Station or get them all killed. What? If we don't restart it the Valeth way, he suggested. Or what if we bypass the resonance system entirely and run direct power conduits? The silence that followed was deafening. Solanis stared at him like he'd suggested performing surgery with a sledgehammer. Direct conduits, she repeated. That's incredibly crude. The energy fluctuations alone would be catastrophic. Maybe, Doyen agreed, but it would also be something the saboteurs aren't expecting. They've been planning around your technology. They don't know anything about human engineering methods. Kiwon was already pulling up schematics on his tablet. It could work. We'd need to reroute through secondary systems and install manual control switches, but yeah, crude doesn't mean ineffective. The risk is enormous, Solanis warned. If you miscalculate the power flows, you could overload the entire grid. The resulting explosion would kill everyone on the station. And if we do nothing, the saboteurs win and everyone dies anyway, Yerin pointed out. At least this way we're fighting. Back. The work that followed was the most intense of Doyun's life. While Kiwon and a team of brave Valeth engineers worked to install emergency power conduits, Yerin battled the saboteurs in cyberspace, hunting down corrupted code and fixing it faster than they could break it. Doyun found himself crawling through maintenance tunnels barely wide enough for his shoulders, splicing human-designed power cables into alien systems that hummed with barely contained energy. One wrong connection, and he'd be vaporized instantly. Power flow looks good in section C, Kiwon reported over the comm. But I'm reading some weird harmonics in the crystal matrix. That's the saboteurs trying to destabilize the repairs. Yerin's voice crackled with static. They're adapting faster than I expected. I can hold them off, but not for long. Another Reactor failed, then another. The station's power grid was collapsing in real time, and they were racing against both technological failure and active sabotage. "We need to bring the main reactor back online," Solani said, her voice tight with desperation. "It's the only way to stabilize the grid." "How dangerous is that?" Doyen asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "Extremely. The main reactor core is directly exposed to the resonance field. If something goes wrong, whoever's in there won't have time to escape." Doyen looked around at his team, Kiwon covered in crystal dust from crawling through conduits, Yerin's eyes red from staring at screens for hours, Selanis and her people trusting human engineers with technology that could destroy their home. "Then, we'd better make sure nothing goes wrong," he said. Sometimes being human meant doing impossible things simply because they needed to be done. The main reactor core of Valeth Prime Station was like standing inside a miniature sun. Waves of energy pulsed through the crystal walls in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with barely contained power. Doyun's radiation detector was clicking so fast it sounded like an angry insect. "The resonance field is completely unstable," Arin said, reading from a Valeth diagnostic tool that looked more like a piece of jewelry than a scanner. "The saboteurs have corrupted the core frequency algorithms. If we can't restore harmonic balance in the next 20 minutes, the reactor will overload." "And if it overloads?" Doyen asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The explosion will vaporize everything within a 50-kilometer radius, including your ship." Doyen wiped sweat from his forehead. The protective suits they wore were designed for Valeth physiology, and they didn't quite fit human bodies properly. No pressure then. Arin had insisted on coming with him into the reactor core, despite her father's objections and her own lack of technical training. "I know these systems," she'd argued, "and I know the pure path. They're my people too, even if I disagree with them." Now, watching her work with calm efficiency while radiation alarms blared around them, Doyen was glad she'd come. Her understanding of Valeth technology was the only thing keeping them from making fatal mistakes. There, Arin pointed to a section of the reactor wall where the crystal matrix was flickering irregularly. "The corruption is centered in the primary harmonic regulator. If we can restore the original frequency pattern—" "How do we do that?" Doyen interrupted as another alarm joined the chorus. His radiation detector was now clicking so fast it was practically a steady tone. "Manual recalibration. Someone has to physically adjust the crystal resonators while someone else monitors the harmonic patterns." Arin's face was pale, but her voice remained steady. "The problem is, the person doing the adjustments will be exposed to lethal levels of radiation." That's when the saboteurs struck again. The lights went out without warning, plunging the reactor core into darkness, broken only by the eerie glow of unstable energy patterns. Emergency power kicked in a second later, but in that brief moment of blackness, something had changed. "The containment field is failing," Arin said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "They've triggered a cascade failure in the safety systems." Doyen's training kicked in. He'd spent 15 years working with dangerous machinery, and the first rule was always the same: when things go wrong, work the problem. "What's our time frame?" "Minutes, maybe less." Arin was frantically working her diagnostic scanner. "The radiation levels are spiking. We need to evacuate." "What about the station?" "If we leave now, the reactor will destroy itself and take the station with it. If we stay—" She didn't finish the sentence. Doyen looked at the crystal matrix. That controlled the reactor's core functions. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, patterns of light flowing through structures that seemed to grow rather than being built. "Can you talk me through the recalibration process?" "Doyen, no, the radiation exposure will kill you." "Maybe, but if we don't try, everyone on the station dies for certain." He was already moving toward the regulator controls. "Besides, I'm human. We're tougher than we look." The next few minutes were the longest of Doyen's life. Following Arin's instructions, he manually adjusted crystal after crystal, watching harmonic patterns shift and change on displays he barely understood. The radiation was cooking him slowly, and he could feel his body starting to shut down, but the reactor was stabilizing. "That's it," Arin called out. "The primary harmonics are back in balance. Just one more adjustment to the secondary matrix and—" That's when the ceiling collapsed. Not the whole ceiling, just a section directly above, where Aaron was standing. Emergency bulkheads, weakened by the cascade failures, finally gave way to the stress. Tons of twisted metal and crystal came crashing down. Doyon moved without thinking. He threw himself forward, tackling Aaron and rolling both of them away from the impact zone. The debris missed them by inches, but the shock wave from its impact sent them tumbling across the reactor chamber floor. When the dust settled, they found themselves trapped. The fallen debris had blocked the main exit, and smaller chunks were still falling from the damaged ceiling. Worse, the reactor was destabilizing again from the vibrations. "I can't reach the secondary matrix from here," Aaron said, struggling to her feet. "And the remote controls aren't responding." That's when she saw Doyon. He was conscious, but barely. The combination of radiation exposure and the physical trauma from their fall had left him weak and disoriented. "Can you move?" she asked. "Working on it," he mumbled, trying to stand up and failing. Aaron looked at the secondary matrix, then at the blocked exit, then at Doyun's radiation detector, which was now screaming a steady alarm. In that moment, she made a choice that went against everything she'd been taught about self-preservation and royal protocol. She grabbed Doyon under the arms and started dragging him toward the secondary matrix controls. "What are you doing?" he protested weakly. "Saving your life," she replied simply, "and finishing what we started." Working alone, with radiation levels that would have killed most beings in minutes, Aaron completed the recalibration. Her hands moved across the crystal controls with desperate precision while she used her own body to shield Doyon from the worst of the radiation exposure. The reactor stabilized with a deep, harmonious tone that seemed to resonate in their bones. Emergency crews broke through the debris moments later, finding both of them unconscious but alive. Later in the medical bay, High Counselor Theron stood between their recovery beds with an expression Doyon had never seen before. "My daughter tells me you saved her life," he said quietly. "Again." "She saved mine too," Doyon replied. "I would have died in there if she hadn't." "Yes," Theron interrupted, "she did. Which means, according to our laws, the life debt is now balanced. You saved her, she saved you. The cosmic scales are even." Doyon felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. "So we're done? No more ceremonies or honor bonds?" "You are free to return to your ship and your life," Theron confirmed. "Though you should know that the Valeth people will always remember what you did here. Both of you." Sometimes, Doyon thought as he watched Aaron sleeping peacefully in the next bed, the best way to solve an impossible problem was to replace it with a different impossible problem. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the second problem solved itself. 2 weeks after nearly dying in a reactor core, Doyon found himself in the strangest situation of his life, sitting in a Valeth garden, drinking something that tasted like liquid starlight, while alien children played games that defied physics around crystalline trees. "Strange how normal this feels now," he said to Aaron, who was sitting beside him on what the Valeth called a harmony bench, a piece of furniture that somehow adjusted. Its shape to perfectly fit whoever was using it. "Normal is relative," Aaron replied with a smile. "A month ago I had never met a human. Now I find myself thinking in human concepts like individual choice and personal freedom. My tutors are horrified. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind. So have changes." News of the reactor crisis had spread throughout Valeth space, along with the story of how human engineers had saved their most important station. Suddenly, humans weren't just strange aliens with crude technology. They were the people who had risked their lives to help strangers. "Your friend Kiwon has become something of a celebrity," Aaron mentioned. "The Engineering Guild wants to award him their highest honor. He keeps trying to explain that he was just doing his job." "That's very human of him," Doyon laughed. "We're not good at accepting praise for doing what we think is right." "Yes, I've noticed that. It's fascinating and frustrating at the same time." The garden around them was bustling with activity. For the first time in Valeth history, their space station was hosting an extended cultural exchange program. Human engineers worked alongside Valeth technicians, sharing knowledge and learning from each other. Human diplomats attended Valeth council meetings, while Valeth scholars studied human philosophy and ethics. Captain Jamin walked up to their bench, looking more relaxed than Doyon had seen him in weeks. "The New Horizon is ready to depart whenever you are," he told Doyen. "Though I have to say, after all this excitement, hauling mining equipment is going to feel pretty boring." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Doyen replied. "I could use some boring for a while." "Before you go," Aaron said, standing up gracefully, "there's something I want to show you." She led them to a section of the station Doyen hadn't seen before, a massive observation deck with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out into space. But what caught his attention wasn't the view. It was the dozens of humans and Valeth working together at various stations, their conversations a mix of musical Valeth tones and human chatter. "This is the new diplomatic corps," Aaron explained. "Humans and Valeth working together to establish formal relations between our peoples, not based on ancient laws or cosmic debts, but on mutual respect and shared goals." "And you're part of this?" Doyen asked. "I'm leading it," Aaron said with quiet pride. "My father wasn't entirely pleased with my decision to give up my position in the royal household, but he understands the importance of what we're building here." High Counselor Theron appeared as if summoned, moving with that fluid grace that all Valeth seemed to possess. His expression was softer than when Doyen had first met him, though no less dignified. "Engineer Kim," he said formally, "before you depart, I wanted to express the gratitude of the Valeth people, not because of any debt or obligation, but because it is right to acknowledge those who help others." "You're welcome, Counselor, though honestly your daughter did most of the work in that reactor core." "Yes, she did, and that perhaps is the most important lesson we have learned from this entire experience." Theron looked at his daughter with obvious pride. Aaron chose to risk her life not because duty compelled her, but because she believed it was right. That is a very human way of thinking, and we are better for learning it. Jiwon, the diplomat, joined their group with a satisfied expression. "The formal alliance treaty is ready for signing," she announced. "Trade agreements, technology sharing, mutual defense pacts, the works. This is going to change everything. For both our species. All because one engineer couldn't stand to watch someone die," Aaron mused. "That's how the best changes usually start," Doyen said. "Someone sees something wrong and decides to fix it, regardless of the consequences." As the New Horizon prepared to leave Valeth space, Doyen stood in the observation lounge, watching the crystalline beauty of Valeth Prime Station grow smaller in the distance. His crewmates were busy preparing for their next cargo run, but his mind was still processing everything that had happened. Minho joined him at the window. "Any regrets about turning down alien nobility?" "Are you kidding? Can you imagine me trying to navigate royal politics? I can barely handle engineering department meetings. Still, it would have been quite a story. The human who became an alien." "Prince." Doyen thought about that for a moment. "I think this is a better story. The human who helped save a space station and made friends with an alien princess. The human who proved that doing the right thing doesn't require ancient laws or cosmic obligations, just the courage to act when action is needed. Think we'll see them again?" "I'm sure of it," Doyen said, watching the stars wheel past. "Aaron's going to make sure humans and Valeth stay friends, and knowing her, she'll probably drag us into a few more adventures along the way." "Good adventures or bad adventures?" "With Aaron involved, probably both." As the New Horizon jumped to hyperspace, carrying them toward their next destination, Doyen reflected on the strange truth that sometimes the simplest actions could have the most profound consequences. He'd saved one life and accidentally started a diplomatic revolution. He'd refused to be bound by alien law and ended up helping two species understand each other better. It was, he decided, a very human kind of paradox, and he wouldn't have it any other way.